Bonjour et bienvenue à cette session de clôture du programme de la 25e édition des Assises. Dans cette édition, plus que jamais, les enjeux liés à la désinformation et à la confiance numérique se sont envolés. Alors, que faire face à un monde où la désinformation monte, les outils aident à cette recrudescence de désinformation par les deepfakes, par les fraudes au président. Que faire? Il faut revenir au mot confiance. La confiance numérique peut s'effriter, mais on ne va pas la laisser partir. Il faut ainsi construire un réseau, un tissu de confiance avec nos partenaires clés qui peuvent nous aider à comprendre mieux tout ce qu'il y a derrière cette face noire de la désinformation. Et sans tarder, je vous demande d'accueillir Stu Solomon.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us today. This is actually my second time here on the stage at Les Assises, and I'm really excited to be able to talk about digital trust and really a subset of digital trust, as we were just discussing a moment ago, this notion of agentic trust. In the age of AI, in a time where there's a proliferation both in our mindset and on the internet of activity that's machine-based, a subset of bot-based activity is agentic behaviors. And it's an area that's still emerging from a technical perspective, and certainly an area that's still emerging from the way that we think about the concept and how to, therefore, as defenders of our networks, the concepts behind defense of agentic behaviors. So I thought I'd take a little bit of time to kind of work through some of the problems, some trends that we're seeing, and ultimately get into a couple of scenarios that I think help us to do the thing that matters most, which is to build a level of trust associated with agentic behavior so that you can ultimately manage and turn this into a business enabler and business growth opportunity for all of us, because ultimately that's what we're here to do. And I think that's an important part of the conversation. You know, if you go back to page 1 of the CISSP manual, you started off with this notion of the CIA triangle. We're all responsible for building for the confidentiality, availability, and integrity of our networks and the data associated with the networks, and ultimately all of the applications that run inside of our networks. Well, those days of that being the foundation of security are starting to run into a number of more modern attack patterns and scenarios that we have to prepare for. Today's discussion will be all about that. Now, I thought that I would get my most difficult slide out of the way up front, but it also establishes a wonderful framework for today's conversation. So if you think about a little play on words to start today, the play on words is this. In Latin, the concept of agere, or to act, to put into motion, to have an activity, became the foundation for words that we're all familiar with, such as an agent or an individual actor. Or in French, the concept of agence, or the idea that an organization is going to be empowered to create some activity on behalf of others and organize as such. And then ultimately leading to this concept of agency, or this rather abstract view of giving permission to a group or an action or an activities to act on my behalf. All of that leads down the path of agentics, where we are today. In my mind, just to set the definition of what agentics are, I would very rudimentary describe them as this concept whereby you give authority and autonomy to act on your behalf to a machine-based activity. That machine-based activity over time continues to learn based on behaviors, based on observances, based on intuition, and based on knowledge to start to create a pathway to act on your behalf before you even tell it to act. And it decides how to act in the next steps in a sequence without the full understanding and instructions that are directly input into it, because it's learned from your behaviors and your history. That agentic behavior is the foundation for what I think to be the next wave of modern e-commerce. Now, as we all sit in the room as security professionals, it's important to think about that notion of the modern e-commerce as the ultimate brand protection responsibility that we all have. Because at the end of the day, our businesses are entrusting us with creating an outcome that's protected, safe, and trusted. And the notion of an agentic behavior is stretching that paradigm significantly. So with that in mind, there's a foundational element that's worth exploring, and that foundational element is the notion that we've hit a tipping point in our lives, in technology, and in the internet as a whole, whereby the traffic that's generated by machines, by bots, and ultimately by agentic bots, is actually now more than the human interactions on the internet. Let's think about that for a second. We've hit a tipping point where more than 50% of activity on the internet is no longer directly with a human behind it. Now, perhaps a human is instructing it, enabling it, and allowing it, but they're not necessarily the activity themselves. More on that in just a moment. So this very concept that we've all grown up with, where there's a very binary decision in the logic between a human and a bot, a human being synonymous with good, a bot being synonymous with bad, that's just simply no longer the case in an increasingly agentic world. So let's take a step back and think about that. A human could have good intent or bad intent. A human can take good actions or bad actions. Same thing from a bot. We need and want bots to be able to create automated workflows and to be able to take actions on our behalf, to be able to shrink and to scale the complexities of the internet and of digital interactions. At the same token, an unauthorized bot or a bot that's acting on behalf of a bad human with bad intent could be doing all kinds of things such as scraping or crawling without permission and creating fraudulent transactional behaviors. Well, the same thing holds true as we get into a more a world with generative AI at its core, and I think all of us use generative AI in our daily lives now, which is foundationally interesting because maybe even a year ago we probably weren't. Well, as the proliferation of generative AI comes to fore, we start to think about things very differently when it comes to just cramming knowledge and information in the synthetic world to be able to make decisions around what we're seeing and what do we trust and what models are they predicated on, what sources are they pulling data from. There's this constant conversation of good and bad, ill-intentioned or positive intentions, and ultimately trust or not trust. We now get to the agentic world. From an agentic perspective, you're taking that a step further. You're now saying this automated workflow that you want to occur is going to continue to learn and evolve based on my behaviors and observances and start to take actions on my behalf, ultimately leading to a transaction. Do I want that transaction to occur? Is the outcome of that transaction appropriate or not? These are key and core concerns as we get into this conversation. Ultimately, it all boils down to a singular focus, and that singular focus is around intent. Intent helps us to establish context. Context helps us to triangulate between infrastructure, activities, and outcomes to be able to create a level of trust, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail here in a moment. So this is what I would consider to be the modern e-commerce journey. And as you look at this, again, through the lens of a security practitioner, you probably focus historically at the very end of this value stream, if you will. We're focused on the transaction. And within that transaction, we're always looking to determine, is there indicators or are there indicators of fraudulent activities or behaviors? And what do we do to be able to add just a little bit more friction, a little bit further to the left in the value stream to be able to prevent those negative outcomes from occurring? But it's very much focused on the end of the journey. Well, the reality is that the journey starts for a consumer much, much earlier in the process. You're first attracted to an ad. That ad or that digital ad content, whether it's placed on a website or in a connected device or in a gaming environment or inside of a podcast, is subject to all kinds of fraudulent manipulation by automated bot activity, which creates a certain level of scale to be able to perpetuate that fraud. If you're ultimately able to attract an individual to an ad appropriately, the next thing you want them to do is click on that ad. That ad will take them to a website. That website allows them for the opportunity to establish a relationship, perhaps log in, perhaps authenticate in some fashion, set up an account. And then ultimately that leads to a transactional behavior at the end. You go shopping, you buy something, you join an affinity club, you make a decision, you get educated. All of those different scenarios, from the time that you're first attracted to a brand through an advertisement, all the way to the time it compels you to act, and then ultimately to be able to transact, that entire process represents, in the agentic world, a massive surface area of risk. That surface area of risk is ever expanding, and there are lots of different friction points along the way to be able to, A, create fraud, and B, to be able to slow down or prevent fraud, but only if you know how and where to look. And that's all predicated on establishing a trust journey through that entire cycle or that entire process. So the reality is, as you start to look at the different tooling that we've all grown up with and used over time, it's all predicated on being able to start to look at things through a discrete series of events. Events could lead to incidents. Incidents lead to all kinds of bad outcomes. But they're very much point-in-time views and predicated on specific telemetry that you're able to capture. I would argue that there's a new paradigm that's required to be able to operate in a more agentic world, again, one where there's authority and autonomy and an ability to continuously evolve from a threat pattern perspective. And that's associated with adaptive controls. So applying an adaptive control takes into account not just the observable activity and the infrastructure associated with it, but also starts to look at things like the intent of the desired outcome, the activity associated and the behaviors associated. By marrying together all three, you start to get a much more cohesive view as to what the appropriate outcome is and how much trust you want to place in a particular agentic or agent-based activity. So here's kind of the real big picture as you think about this. You know, the entire digital shopping and payment industry on the internet is predicated on a really foundational concept, which is there is a human being on the other side of the computer screen as they interface with a digital world and make a transaction. All of the controls that we've put in place, all of the fraud prevention scenarios that we look for, all of the ways that a digital transaction occurs are all based on this very basic notion that a human being is executing the transactions. Well, that's just simply not true in the agentic world. And the agentic world, as we'll talk about in a moment, is here. It's not tomorrow, but it's actually today. So as recently as last week, you start to see an industry consortium led by Google start to put together a scenario whereby they said that you have to build a new protocol to be able to create a payment channel that's ultimately trusted. That payment channel predicated on trust really starts with building what they call the 3 A's. The 3 A's being, one, is the transaction and interaction authentic? Does it have the right authority to do what it's trying to do? And then ultimately, is it accountable? Because if you're going to transact, you want to be able to create that trust, you want to have that understanding, and ultimately, somebody's on the hook for the goods and services and the payment methods that are transacting across that paradigm. So building that protocol is a really essential way to think about this, and it's a completely different way than the way that we think about the transaction today. The idea that there's just a human being on the other side of the transaction just simply isn't the case. Now there are bot-based activities operating in good faith with good intent to be able to create a similar outcome that we've given full authority to. Therefore, you need verifiable credentials to be able to make that decision around authority, authenticity, and ultimately accountability. So as we do that, you start to think about the broader world of kind of e-commerce in this particular space, and you see that there's a completely different scenario where the human isn't just directly interfacing with a website, but you could go to a website and you'll start to interface with a chatbot. And that chatbot may help you to guide you through questions and answers and help you to make decisions on how to navigate a particular website through its complexities. You then get into decisions that you would interface with a bot from a third-party perspective that helped you to identify where to go looking in the first place, as you used an LLM as an example, or an interface with an LLM to be able to cut down your research time to be able to find that website in the first place and guide you to that location that the chatbot might help you to navigate. And then ultimately, there's a consumer agent or somebody now emerging from a technical machine-based perspective that will actually anticipate and take the next steps for you. So the way that this looks, as you kind of think about this, is a really simplistic view of that notion of human to website to transaction starts to actually take a very different framework and approach. That approach starts with using a bot to be able to discover and do research to find that website in the first place, to be able to make decisions on what to do when you get there, and then ultimately helps you to navigate and make decisions on what the next action is to enable your transaction. Well, on the other side of that decision to transact, the website, the merchant, is using bots to be able to look at inventory, to determine pricing, to be able to place an order, and ultimately to place shipment scenarios. So what you actually have is a very different scenario, which looks something like, I'll go backwards, which I'll ignore it, which ultimately leads to a scenario whereby what you really have is two bots talking to each other. No longer do you have a scenario where you have a human talking to a website using machine language, but now you have a scenario where you have a bot we're acting on behalf of the consumer, interfacing with a bot that's acting on behalf of a merchant, and now you have a bot-to-bot behavior with no human in the middle at all, both presuming that the human activity is the right and trusted scenario. Trust is the key. So as I said a moment ago, this really isn't science fiction. This isn't the wave of the future. This is actually today. I'd like to show you over my shoulder here a little demonstration of what I'm talking about. So what we have is an actual website that my company happened to put together for testing purposes. This website, in this particular case, is set up to be able to sell cakes. I'll click play. You could kind of watch it build over time. Asked a very simple question. Happened to be through Perplexity. And it was, hey, can you go ahead and go shopping and buy me 3 cakes? So the bot set out to interface with the website, started looking for cakes. It immediately realized that the first thing you had to do was navigate the website to the order form. It made the decision to prompt me to say, is it OK if I go and interface to be able to go to the order form? I said yes. It then said, OK, the next scenario is I need to be able to determine the quantity. You said 3 cakes. This only says 1 on the order form. Can I go ahead and click here to be able to add 3 cakes to the cart? I said, great. The next thing it says is, OK, mission complete. I've go ahead and I've ordered 3 cakes. It's going to cost $750. All right, now what does that tell us? That tells us that what it's lacking is the awareness to understand that, yes, it accomplished the goal of going out to a website, getting that website to get cakes into a cart and to order those cakes, but I probably wasn't going to give it my credit card and authorization at this point, at that price point. It never asked me that. It didn't ask me about the risks. It only tried to accomplish the outcome, and this was all done through agentic behavior. So a perfect opportunity to understand a little bit of the risks associated with that. Now we go a step further, and I really feel strongly that we're in this age of what we would consider to be digital Darwinism, or this idea that there's a constant cat and mouse game between those who attack and those who defend. That scaling scenario is only intensified by machine-based activity or bot-based activity. But even now, there are lower barriers to entry where those with nascent skills or lesser skills can use not just generative AI, but agentic AI to be able to create an outsized impact that isn't necessarily controlled by the intentions or expectations. Much like our definitions around insider threat, where it could be somebody that's either intentional or unintentional, still creating an outcome, the same thing holds true here. If you looked at that cake example, we had a bot that was acting with good intention and accomplished the goal that we set out to do, but it didn't have the wherewithal or understanding to say that I would never buy $750 worth of cakes. Same thing here from a digital Darwinism perspective. This concept of this constant cycle between attacker and attackee, between innovation and of an attacker versus the ability to cut down the amount of time and innovation necessary to close that gap for a defender is constantly shifting, and agentics are simply part of that. So how do we defeat it? We defeat it by first starting to understand that you have to create this level of trust along the way. And not all agents are created equal. Most of the funding and most of our projects in our enterprises go into helping to build agents and agentic behavior that's specific to be able to automate workflows in our environments. We also have chatbots on our websites to interface with our clients. We also have consumer agents and we have merchant agents, as I mentioned earlier. Each one brings with it its own challenge and its own set of implications, but they all boil down to a central concept, and that central concept is, how do you establish and maintain trust? So, part of establishing and maintaining trust is also understanding what the bad guys are up to. One of the core and emerging TTPs that we've seen that I think is quite relevant, my company took a little snapshot in time over a couple of months to look at traffic that was observable, and what we saw, frankly, was both shocking and also not surprising at the same time. Spoofing is occurring at alarmingly high rates right now. for traffic that would be purported to look like and feel like traffic that you would expect to see from a known source, where the bad guys are actually going out of their way to obfuscate the infrastructure and the characteristics associated with queries that would look and feel like activity that would be associated with legitimate interfacing with the larger generative AI scenarios like a ChatGPT. So what we saw with the traffic, as an example, 1 in 18 queries or interfaces that were created were spoofed from in general. But much more importantly, what we saw, and this isn't really a surprise, indicative of many of the larger generative AI tools, the spoofing rate went up significantly when you looked at something that looked a lot like ChatGPT and presented itself as ChatGPT, but simply wasn't. It was a bad guy trying to do a bad thing. We saw a spoofing rate of nearly 1 in 6 of the number of interactions versus the amount that was spoofed. A significant amount of activity going into spoofing right now. Now, why does this matter? This matters because all of us in our security roles are trying to determine basic visibility into the amount of generative AI and ultimately agentic traffic that's touching our websites, touching our enterprises, touching our environments. And it's really hard to ascertain what is real and what is not, what is trusted and what is expected and what is not. Obviously, establishing a baseline is the start, but ultimately enabling is the goal for all of us. So we're at this really strange intersection right now where we understand that agentic behavior is the wave of the future from a commerce perspective, that the use of generative AI capabilities and bot-based capabilities are scaling, and they ultimately equal growth for our businesses. But at the same time, they represent a massive increase in the surface area of risk, and they also represent a significant amount of uncertainty in our ability to understand and establish what a baseline of good looks like, to be able to look for those anomalies or deviations from the baseline of the norm. So ultimately, what we have to do as we think about this scenario is to establish trust during that initial interaction with a bot. Do you trust it the first time you see it? Now, the next component is, do you trust it as it continues to go through its life cycle of activities? And then ultimately, do you trust in the outcome that it created? Remember this notion of authenticity, authority, and accountability. The same holds true here. Trust is a cycle. It's not a point-in-time action. It's a series of actions over time. So here over my shoulder, you see a great scenario where there's an easy way to start to establish trust, and it's a cryptographic scenario that allows us to do that. On the black side of the screen, you'll see a direct interaction where somebody's typing in a prompt. In this case, what we're asking the agent to do is to go out and book a trip to Paris. As the request goes in, it starts to crawl for different sites to find an airline ticket and hotel reservations. And the first thing that we're doing is we're challenging that agent to look at the cryptographic information to make sure that there's a public key that's been passed, that there's a certificate available or a token that's available to be able to establish that trust in the first place. Once that trust is established, that cryptographic interface, you can now allow it to start to take the next steps to be able to transact on your behalf. Establishing that initial level of trust is a great way to start to defeat potentially malicious bot activity. But of course, this all starts and stops with visibility of your environment in the first place. So before you can even get into a scenario where you're challenging a particular agent and making sure that it is of the right trust factor and that you have a digital identity associated with it, that you have a trust in, you have to start with the first thing that matters most, which is visibility. How do I know what my surface area is? How do I know what's touching my environment? Once I establish that visibility, I now want to answer the contextual questions that help me understand intent. Those contextual questions of the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, the how. Those things that help me to understand that the behaviors are expected, the behaviors are authorized, and the behaviors will create the right outcome. So this is all about establishing trust from a technical perspective, marrying that with behavioral actions and intent and context to be able to make the final decision. Now, just a couple of final points as I wrap up the conversation, and it's worth mentioning. As I said earlier, this is something that's happening today. This isn't in the future. So a couple of simple stats. Right now, the vast majority of interfaces with bot-based activity specific to agentic behaviors are really predicated on helping to enable searches. But as you see, there's starting to be things like logins and transactions that are starting to creep into the overall amount of traffic that we're seeing. Let's look at it a little bit differently. As I teased earlier, over 50% of traffic today is driven on the internet, not by humans, but by bots. But what we're seeing, and as an example, Cisco and Gartner have both come up with different studies that have led us to understand that, in actuality, upwards of 80% of all interactions on the internet and traffic on the internet will actually be based on bot and agentic behaviors within 10 years, nearly 80%. Now, what does that look like right now? Well, right now, just over a snapshot that my company took across our surface area of over 500 clients across the globe in the digital e-commerce space, what we saw is a massive increase of just transactional behaviors driven by agentic bots just over the last 3 months. And within that, you'll see those little lines at the very top of the graph that indicate scenarios that aren't just about interfacing with generative AI tools, but starting to see agentic behaviors around things like account logins and things like transactions. So this is occurring, and we're seeing this right now in our environment. So ultimately, here's the punchline. The punchline is, as we said, it's no different than all of the other technical revolutions that all of us have been responsible for helping to safeguard our companies and our enterprises as threats emerge associated with them, and ensuring that business enablement occurs. That business enablement starts and stops with that notion of layers of trust. As I said a moment ago, you have to establish initial trust, you have to have persistent trust over time, and then you have to trust the outcome. Now, where things are different is that in an arena where adaptive controls are necessary to marry together context, behavioral context, intent, and all the technical observances, this becomes a feedback loop that's constantly evolving, or infinite, as you see here depicted. That concept of infinite adaptive controls are the critical elements that will make us successful in an increasingly agentic world. So, as you think about it, as I said, spoofing is on the rise. Fraud perpetuated by agentic behaviors is expected to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars within the next few years. But you have to marry that with the fact that many of us are already starting to interface with our agentic world and with our merchants in a fashion that requires that we have a trusted relationship that persists over time, because we can't hide our heads and it won't go away. This is the security problem of tomorrow starting to occur today. Now, what are we going to do to get in front of that challenge? Ultimately, it boils down to this. We have to secure every customer journey through that entire life cycle that I spoke of earlier, from the time that a brand is first established with an advertisement, all the way to the time that an individual interfaces with that digital ad content, goes to a website, makes a decision, authenticates, logs in, sets up an account, goes shopping, transacts. That entire cycle gives us opportunities to be able to get much further to the left in creating friction and to protect our environments. That's based on starting with visibility, understanding what your surface area of risk is, understanding what good or bad traffic looks like, what appropriate traffic looks like, what authentic traffic looks like, and what intended traffic looks like, and then putting the controls in place to be able to add both policy-based scenarios and more fine-grained scenarios to be able to tune that friction to allow the traffic that should occur to occur. And then ultimately do this all the time. This isn't a one or some. This is an always on control and always on set of capabilities. That leads to the one thing that you probably don't think about when you wake up in the morning as a security professional, but you absolutely should, which is this is all predicated on protecting your brand. And in a modern e-commerce world, protecting your brand is essential to the outcome you're trying to create. So with that, I greatly appreciate your time today. I've very much enjoyed this conversation, and I hope if you have any questions, I'll be sticking around right after. You could also see me at our booth, Human Security, at booth B17, and I look forward to the discussion and dialogue. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Stay with me.
Ah, wonderful.
Le mot de la fin. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
First, trust first.
Trust first.
But watching what the danger is, basically.
That's correct.
Chers amis des Assises, j'ai pas envie de vous quitter, mais comme toutes les belles choses, même cette conférence de clôture finie, continuez avec le reste des ateliers, des rendez-vous. Ce n'est pas encore fini, mais vous êtes une communauté avec plein d'énergie et tout va bien se passer. Bon après-midi. Thank you so much.